Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our panel, What's Next? Toward a More Perfect Union. Please welcome our panelists. Mayor, City of Atlanta, Kasim Reed. Vice President, Ecomagination, General Electric, Mark Vachon. Senior Vice President, Advanced Technology and Projects, Motorola Mobility, Rugina E. Dugan. Director and CEO, NYSE Euronext, Inc., Duncan Niederauer. Astrophysicist and Director, Hayden Planetarium, American Museum of Natural History, Neil deGrasse Tyson. And please welcome back our moderator, President Bill Clinton.
Thank you very much. We were talking as the other panel was proceeding about how we could conduct this session in a way that would be most valuable to you and your interests. And I just wanted to emphasize a couple of things. One, Rugina Dugan is now Vice President for Advanced Technology and Projects of Motorola Mobility, newly acquired by Google. But before that, she was the director of DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which is supposed to create strategic surprise for our side and prevent it for our side. But they do a lot of things, and they really did create the internet. DARPA was the internet when I became president. There were 50 sites on the entire World Wide Web when I became president. More than that have been added since I began talking. Duncan Niederauer is the CEO of the New York Stock Exchange Euronext, but he also is one of the people that helped to pass the crowdfunding legislation in Congress to try to get more broad-based financing for new good ideas. Kasim Reed, you know as the mayor of Atlanta. What you may not know is that he had $1.5 billion of unfunded pension liability, which he has corrected, and his city reserves were down to $7.4 million when he took office, and they're more than $100 million now. So he's doing well. Mark Vachon is the Vice President of Eco-Imagination at GE, and I've done a lot of work with GE and Mr. Immel, partly on the President's Jobs Council and this Green Buildings Initiative. But they're involved in a lot of ways, and I hope he will tell you some of them, because the whole idea of preserving the environment and the explicit mission of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions involves a lot more technology in a lot more areas than is commonly supposed. And of course, Neil deGrasse Tyson is our country's most well-known astrophysicist. So I asked him if we were alone in the universe or not, because in the last year or so, our telescopes parked in outer space or parked on planet Earth have identified about 10 planets outside our solar system, which seem to be far enough away from their suns and of coherent physical substance enough like Earth that they might support life. So we got 10 possibilities out there we know of, and I told him that I wish I were 20 so I could find out whether we're alone or not, and he looked at me and he smiled. Well, maybe it'll happen fast enough, you'll know anyway. So I say that because all these people in one way or another are involved in the future business. And I think all advanced societies, sooner or later, going all the way back to the Sumerians 8,000 years ago, get in trouble when they become more obsessed with holding on to present gains than creating future possibilities. When the people running all the great public and private institutions become more interested in holding on to their positions than advancing the purposes for which they were established. It would be hard to read a constitution any better designed to keep a country in the future business than the American Constitution. But the older you become as a country, the more you acquire the accoutrements of age. And the better you get at holding on to what you've got, and sometimes the more callous you are about creating more possibilities. We were talking back then in 1862, in the teeth of the Civil War, when the whole existence of America was in question. In his first term as president, Abraham Lincoln extended the railroad all across the continent so we could become a continental country, signed the Morrill Land Grant Act to set aside land in every state in the country for a state university, giving us the world's best system of higher education, signed the Homestead Act to encourage people to go out and settle the country and giving them land to do so, and as Neil never stops reminding the world, established the National Science Foundation. The guy was in the future business while holding on with all his might and giving his life to maintain the Union. And that's what the Emancipation Proclamation was about too. Not just being faithful to the past, but creating the future. So what I want to say is that all these budget negotiations, I hate all this debt. And I favor investment in jobs now, but a gradual and eventually dramatic reduction in our debt liabilities. I think it's terrible. But in everybody's, right across the board, the only thing the parties have in common about how they address the debt is that they squeeze the so-called non-defense discretionary budget very hard, because the future doesn't have anything like the constituency the present does. Either the people that want their tax cuts, or they don't want you to fool with their Medicare and whatever else. So I want them to talk a little about this. And maybe we'll start with the practical matter. The mayor has got a proposal that he's been working on and some things that he's passed. How do you deal with this current economic crisis and try to keep the potential for Atlanta's growth and Atlanta's children open for the future?
Well, Mr. President, I think that the problem we have really isn't one of intellectual capital. It's a will problem. I had the pleasure of having lunch with Tom Foley, the speaker who served with you, more than a decade ago in Japan. He was the ambassador to Japan. I asked him what was the hardest thing he ever did. He said the vote to raise taxes so that you could balance a budget and create record jobs, and ended up leaving a surplus. But you could see the pain in his eyes. He said that I did it with the president. We have a will problem. So when you think about the pension problem that we had in the city of Atlanta, where we owed $1.5 billion, we were about 51% funded. We're going to have a bunch of folks retired that walking around with checks that weren't going to cash. I had a decision to make, and I made a decision that in year one, we were going to take it on, and I was going to risk the rest, just like you did. And it turns out that we figured out a way to pay down our pension system, $1.5 billion. We had a 15-0 unanimous vote, and the labor unions joined us because I didn't treat them like enemies. I just presented a math problem and said that I care about you. I learned a lot about that leadership from you. When you look at the problems we're dealing with today, we know what the answers are. You certainly got people in this room who understand what the answers are. The problem is will. And the reason I love being a mayor so much is being a mayor is where hope meets the street. See, I don't get to hide from folks. Folks see me in the grocery store and walking around. And I know that when I make mistakes and don't perform, real people get harmed. When I don't have enough police officers on the street, there's a woman that I might know that's probably getting mugged somewhere. So I think that rather than to discuss these philosophical issues, we have got to hold leaders in the private sector and in the public sector who do not exercise the responsibility of will in doing hard things, even when the price is high. And if you don't want to pay the price, you shouldn't be in the job.
Mark, let me ask you something. I have thought for 15 years since we fashioned the Kyoto Protocol, which was dead on arrival, not just in America, but other places, to climate change, that we would never avert this climate crisis until we proved that there was an economically beneficial way to do that. So when GE set up this Eco-Imagination project, I was actually quite happy, not because I don't recognize that there are things that go way beyond money at stake in the climate debate, but as a practical matter, especially in a time of economic adversity, we're not going to fool with this unless we can prove that there is a sustainable, economically attractive way to do it. So to what extent, based on your actual work, do you believe you have found and that we can and will find economically sustainable ways to save the planet before all hell breaks loose?
Great question. Boy, that feels a little heavy. First of all, thanks for having me. And I accept the fundamental premise that we are in the future business. You're talking to a now 30-year GE guy, notice the gray, in a company that is the only remaining member of the Dow. And why is that? Our predecessors, I think, faced maybe not as large of a challenge we're talking about with climate change and the implementation of clean technology, but equally large in their minds over the last 130 years. And it's been resiliency that's been at the core of that. And that's why, frankly, 8 years ago, we launched Eco-Imagination that said, hey, wake up. We frankly believed in the science. If you think a planning process that doesn't incorporate a very knowable set of facts, whether you believe it's a 40% probability or a 99% probability, in a business environment, that's enough to get busy with what are you going to do about it. And that's what Jeff Immelt, our chairman, did 8 years ago. And if you think about that, it's sort of contemporary and cool today. It was radical 8 years ago for a company like GE to step out and say, we're putting our shoulder behind that. I'll be very honest with you, I wasn't in this job at the time, and I thought that was stunning leadership. But here's the idea, back to your question, Mr. President. We knew the sustainability of Eco-Imagination would not be sustainable if we couldn't connect it to economics, both culturally inside the organization, as well as the sustainability of the value proposition we were going to offer, whether that's to countries, municipalities, companies, individuals. And so the fundamental concept behind Eco-Imagination is that we've been presented with a false choice. You pick one, economics or environmental performance. And we dismiss it. We dismiss that premise. We fundamentally believe that through innovation, we can deliver both and truly drive a sustainability program that has much more dramatic impacts in the global footprint. How's it worked? Just a test here. We'll deliver $27 billion in revenue this year. Here's a little stat I think is important, back to the sustainability piece. The revenue inside this portfolio is growing at twice the rest of the portfolio. So for my business leader colleagues out there, this doesn't have to be a charity program. This can be an incredibly viable economic program for you. And I would dare say that if you're not engaged, you're missing massive markets. Our own footprint reductions have been well over 20% in greenhouse gas, water, and energy. But to be very frank, the technology we put into the marketplace dwarfs that footprint reduction. So I accept your fundamental premise that you have to be in the future business to be in the today business. You know, I'll be honest, we have little check-in points called the quarter and the year. So we have to do both. But we develop technologies in jet engines that have 15 to 20% emission reductions that last for 40 years. These are billion-dollar investments that go over 10 years. Could we rein that in and sort of hunker down in these very challenging times? Absolutely. But my predecessor wouldn't be on a stage another 130 years from now if that's the attitude we took.
Regina, first of all, I think people here might be interested. What do you think the most important thing that happened at DARPA was when you were there? And can you talk about it without violating national security?
So while I was there, we worked on a few things that I think sound so futuristic that people don't believe they're real. We worked on a hypersonic boost glider, unmanned, that could go at Mach 20. Mach 20 is New York to Los Angeles in 11 minutes and 20 seconds. The surface of the airfoil is at 3,500 degrees Fahrenheit. We're essentially burning it as it flies through the air. That's not a prediction about what's possible. Those are things we're building now. Prosthetic arms that could allow an amputee the ability to pick up a raisin or a grape and know the difference. Vaccines that are made in tobacco plants that could potentially stop a pandemic across the world. So one of the most common questions I got when I was the director of DARPA was, what should we be thinking about? Could you please just show us the future, predict the future? And I believe trying to predict the future is a very dangerous and hazardous occupation. In fact, it's not really about predicting it, it's about building it. It's about building that future. And you can see the lever arm of that investment in the future in something like the internet. We talked about this backstage. So that original investment in the internet was about $1 million at DARPA. It's a $1 trillion worldwide industry. Internet ads alone account for over 3 million jobs in the United States. 2.3 billion people worldwide are connected by the internet. And we're starting to use it to solve really hard problems. So my favorite example is a program called Fold It, which is essentially the Tetris of protein folding. So three-dimensional protein folding is one of the hardest problems in biochemistry, and it's important because it helps us to find cures for diseases like cystic fibrosis, Alzheimer's. It involves a lot of detailed calculations and very minute manipulations. It's very complicated. And so a biochemist, a mathematician, and a gamer get together. Sounds like the start of a bad joke. And they decide to make a game for protein folding. And a few years later, hundreds of thousands of people are playing this game, and when you put that kind of brain power behind it, you expect good things to happen. What we didn't expect to happen was the emergence of protein folding savants, people who otherwise couldn't have been contributors to these very hard problems. And let me tell you what happened September of last year. September of last year in Nature, there was an article published. The three-dimensional protein structure for the retroviral protease that contributes to AIDS in rhesus monkeys was solved by the gamers in Fold It. It went 15 years unsolved in the scientific community. The gamers solved it in 15 days. So we could have never predicted those outcomes at the beginning. The point was to put our heads down, invest, and build. So
they'll get an idea of this when we're talking about these future investments, though. And I'll ask Neil the same thing about the National Science Foundation and its affiliated entities. What's the annual budget for DARPA? The annual budget for DARPA is $3 billion. It's 0.5% of the entire DoD budget. 0.5% of the budget. You're getting your money's worth. Duncan, when we were just talking, and Mark talked about even at a big company like GE, he's got certain obligations to his shareholders that have to be manifest once in a while anyway. On the way in here, I asked you about crowdfunding, and you know, because you were involved in passing the legislation through the Congress. So how are we going to finance this? How are we going to get truly future-oriented companies taken public in an appropriate way, priced in an appropriate way, capital flowing in an appropriate way? And to what extent do these guerrilla tactics like crowdfunding, what extent can they play a role in throwing America's future engine into high gear and keeping them creating jobs of the future?
It's a great question, and it's stuff we've been working on actually for a long time, because we view our role at the New York Stock Exchange as the facilitator of all the things the president just talked about. But before I get into the answer, I knew I was on an unusual panel here. We were saying backstage, this is not the panel I would normally be asked to sit on. And my son's going to be the happiest guy when I report the news tonight, because we rather foolishly limit his gaming time on the weekends because we think he should do other things. And as a child, he can
play online.
I know. And as a child with Asperger's syndrome, he's likely to be one of those kids that figures out one of those problems. So I'm going to figure out how to negotiate with him when I have the flight home to figure that out. So thank you, Regina. So hopefully he's not watching. So thank you for that. So to go back to what the president asked about, let's start with a couple of simple facts, right? Because one of the hot topics right now is SMEs, and I don't mean subject matter experts, I mean small and medium enterprises, right? Small businesses. So a couple of facts, just because I think it's always good to start with facts. 99% of the businesses in the United States are what we would all call small businesses, 99%. They employ more than half the workforce in the United States. They are not only the backbone of our economy and our country, they are the most consistent job creators year in, year out, decade in, decade out. Good economy, bad economy, doesn't matter. And even a great company like GE that's sitting here with us today, all the big companies that are great companies today started out as a really small company. Everybody did, right? So these people that we're talking about today that we're trying to figure out a way to help, they're our neighbors, they're our customers, they're the future of the country. We all know that. So we started to try to identify the problem because it was becoming more and more clear. And the problem we identified was, what did they need? They needed, first and foremost, access to working capital, because that's how they run their business and grow their business. But we also found, which I think is the innovation looking a little more forward, that they needed access to intellectual capital in many cases. And I'll get to what I mean by that. Now, what we've tried to instill in the culture at the stock exchange, if we're going to play the role I think we really should be playing, is there's a lot of people who are happy to be in the problem identification business. And they think it's good enough to be in the problem identification business. So we don't let anybody work with us anymore who just wants to be in the problem identification business. We say, if you don't want to be in the solutions business as well, we can make a list of the problems. We got that. We want people who want to work with us, who want to solve it. So to get to the president's question, we did two things. One, we took a legislative approach. And secondly, we took more what I would call a creative, innovative partnership approach that I think is very consistent with what CGI is all about, if I can be that bold. On the legislative side, as the president talked about, we effectively wrote the first version of the Jobs Act. We teamed up with the Venture Capital Association, a few other people that you historically would not have expected us to team up with, because we thought one way to solve the problem was to make it easier for small companies to access the capital markets and grow into full compliance with some of the rules that are overburdening them right now. We changed rules that had been on the books for 50 years, that were great when they were written, but when you looked at them through a 2011, 2012 lens, a simple little change to a rule that said you were exempt from a lot of requirements if you did a $5 million IPO, that made sense in 1980 when a company like Intel went public with a $13 million IPO. 5 million was actually a good number, not now. So a simple change of that from 5 to 50 opens a gate that is closed to so many small companies just with a simple change. And then the last thing the president talked about on that bill, which was important and very controversial, somewhat surprisingly to me, was I got a lot of questions from some fairly senior members of Congress saying, I like everything about this bill except the crowdfunding piece of it. And hopefully you'd be proud to know, although it'll go back to what the mayor said. Maybe we do some things sometimes because we believe him and we don't really think about our own future. I said to them, thanks for your comment. What's your alternative? You give me a solution that's a better solution, I'm all in. You'll have me at hello, as Tom Cruise once said. No, they didn't have an answer. So I said to them, guess what? If you're going to tell me we can't have this in the bill because you don't like it, because you don't think it's regulated enough and you're a little nervous about it, you're in the problem identification business, not the solutions business. So it's going to stay in, and we will make sure, we do our part to put some things around it so that it's quote unquote safe, whatever that means. But let's go back to the facts. A Main Street business that is trying to get a $50,000 or $100,000 loan to grow their business cannot get that money from any bank in this country right now. And don't blame the banks. They're not going to write a $50,000 or $100,000 loan with all the regulation they have to go through. So great, that's again problem identification. We tried to solve it. The crowdfunding initiative, I think if done properly, is actually the future of how most small businesses in this country are going to get financed. Most Main Street businesses aren't going to make it to the New York Stock Exchange or anywhere else. This is just about 5 and 10 person businesses becoming 10 and 20 person businesses because they can grow. So I'll be quicker on the second part, I promise. On the partnership part, we teamed up with a microfinance network and Startup America, and that's all about bringing entrepreneurs who run small businesses together with access to a network of people who will fund them at the microfinance level and then team them up with great companies like GE, because that's where the intellectual capital comes from. And you may be surprised, but if people who work with Mark go out, or people who work, I met with Scott Davis from UPS, one of your companies down in Atlanta. UPS teaches them, a small company, about logistics. Google teaches them how to have a website presence. GE connects with them and says, this is how you want to think about being a startup. And the next thing you know, they're on a totally different trajectory, because folks that work for companies like these get out in the field and say, this is how you can be more successful. Everyone in this room assumes every small business has a website. Try again. Almost none of them do. And if you can just show them how to do that, you help them create a website. UPS shows them how to export, because what's so cool about the future is a 10-person company can have customers in 100 different countries. So those are the kind of things we're working on that we think are all about the future, Mr. President. Thanks.
Thank you. Neil, what are we going to do about the STEM shortage? How are we going to get more kids to study this, stay in school, learn these things, go out and do this work? I mean, it's appalling to me that so many young people don't even know what's going on. Now, this is the most interesting time for biology and physics I can remember in my lifetime. So what can we do?
Yeah, of course, during this conference, I've been part of the STEM education panels division that we all split up into. And there are a lot of great ideas out there. I don't claim particular insight yet into one idea being better than the other. They all sound good. However, I want to put something else on the table, and that is to distinguish the action of recognizing a problem and then finding a solution to that problem and say, okay, we're done. Any other problems? Oh, there's a problem. Then you sort of migrate to that problem, find a solution, and the like. And when you do this, from my perspective, that amounts to putting Band-Aids on a whole suite of challenges that America now faces that, from where I sit, does not address the underlying problem. And I'm reminded of a quote from the French aviator Antoine Saint-Exupéry. I have to paraphrase it, forgive me. But it goes something like, if you want, this aviator is from the turn of the last century, or early aviation. He said, if you want people to sail, you don't gather wood and assign tasks. Instead, what you should do is to compel people to long for the immensity of the sea. And it's that longing that is absent here. And I ask myself, when was the last time we longed? And I got to go back 40 years. I have to go back to the 1960s. That was a decade, the bloodiest, the most turbulent decade on American soil since the Civil War. A Cold War, a hot war, civil rights unrest, campus unrest. Yet we were going to the moon. Yes, it was militaristically conceived, but in fact, one could argue that that's a good thing to do once again on economic terms, and I'll wait for that question to come up if it needs to. The point is, over that decade, the moon was in reach, and we were headed there. And that compelled everyone to dream about tomorrow. In that decade, the World's Fair in New York, which was all about tomorrow, issued forth from that decade. The World's Fair didn't create the 60s. The 60s created the World's Fair. You didn't have to go more than a couple of weeks before a headline in the newspaper or the magazine, the city of tomorrow, the home of tomorrow, transportation of tomorrow. All of this thinking would be brought to you by innovations in science and technology. So we had an understanding in our culture of the value of that. Nor at that time did you need programs to convince people that studying science, engineering, technology, and math was a good thing. They were already beating down the doors because at the time we had a perceived threat from the Soviet Union, but we were also going to the moon, and those headlines were writ large on the daily papers. So I say to myself, oh, one other thing, after Apollo 8 goes to the moon, orbits and comes back, and there's that photo published of Earthrise, Earth, seen not as the cartographer would have you look at it, with color-coded countries. It was Earth as nature would have you grasp it. Oceans, land, clouds. From 1968 to 1972, there would be published the whole Earth catalog. What a concept. The Environmental Protection Agency would be founded in that period. DDT would be banned. The catalytic converter would be introduced. Unleaded gas would be banned. The Comprehensive Clean Air Act, huge updated versions of the Clean Water Act, the Protected Species Act. Doctors Without Borders, what a concept. Who even thought about Earth Without Borders until that photo was published? I assert that once we went to the moon and looked back to Earth, we discovered Earth for the first time. And you can't even put a price on that over that 5-year period. So the space program not only stimulates an innovation nation, it transforms how we even think about Earth to begin with. So I see ambitions in space where we need biologists to look for life, and chemists, and physicists, and 5 branches of engineering. That is STEM future writ large. So a healthy space program, in my judgment, is the measure of the health of your nation going forward in the 21st century, where innovations in science and technology will define who leads the world economically.
But, okay, I agree with that. Look, the average, I was 11 years old when the Sputnik went up, okay? I was 14 or whatever when John Glenn went up. Everybody in my class could talk about that stuff, not just the A students. It was news. We were into it. Okay, now, just look at the stuff that we've learned in the last 2 years. I mentioned the 10 planets. Okay, but look at just some other stuff we've learned. We've learned in the human genome research what the major genetic variances are, 2 of them that put women at high risk of breast cancer. What this means is that if we ever get to the point where we can basically step into, unlike an MRI, we can stand up and be scanned 4 times a year. You can send a gene home with every little card home with every little newborn girl, and we'll know that she's one of those few that have to be checked starting when she's in her, let's say, late 20s. And but thanks to nanotechnology and other things, there need never be a mastectomy again if we do it right from here to there. Maybe nobody will ever die of breast cancer. Nobody's painting this picture. That's a sexy, interesting, fascinating, fabulous thing. And when I was a kid, science and technology, all these things were made interesting. We understood the deal. We found out last year that unless you're 100% descended from sub-Saharan African, which does not include Qasim, or almost any other African American, 100%, between 1% and 4% of your genome comes from our pre-human ancestors, the Neanderthals, because we went across non-African Earth for 40,000 years, and it turns out we liked each other better than we knew. And we survived probably, no one knows, because we could run faster than them, even though they were bigger and stronger than us, and it was an era of giant mammals. But the point is, what are the implications of that? This would have been, if this had been happening in the middle of this period that Neil just described 50 years ago, oh my God, every 9th grade science class in America would have been talking about this. It would have been a big story on the evening news.
We've lost
the
the culture.
only reason I know is I
this.
get to read little bitty articles because I'm home alone a lot. Well, really. I mean, I spend 2 hours a day trying to figure out what the heck's going on. And I'm appalled. So how do we make this interesting again? This is a big deal to America. The economic benefits to America and the geopolitical benefits of building a world where people at least are aware that every non-age-related difference you can see in this room is lodged in 0.5% of our genome, and we spend 99.5% of our time fixated on the 0.5% of us that's different. No one knows stuff like this. If this were 50 years ago, because of the very thing you said, 9th graders would know this. Teachers would be talking about this in school. It would be sexy. Who would want to drop out of school knowing something might happen next year that could affect your life that would be fascinating, that you would like to know? It's a big deal.
I'm just saying, I think that culture has evaporated from our midst. And
so how do we reestablish it?
I say we go back into space in a big way, turn the solar system into our backyard, so that everything that everybody does, if it's advancing a space frontier, you're going to have to innovate to do that. And there's something that has not come up here, because it's not in our nature to think this way, but you have to. Not all science, at its best, has as a prerequisite an application that'll help everybody the next day after the discovery is made. You have to recognize this. You realize there would be no GE Medical were it not for physicists who had first discovered the physical principles upon which those machines were based. Physicists who had no care about health. My physics professor in college discovered the effect that magnetic fields have on the alignment of the nucleus of an atom. Won the Nobel Prize. It took a medical engineer to say, wait a minute, I can turn that into the MRI, one of the most potent diagnostic tools in the arsenal of the medical doctor. If you were in the Band-Aid mentality, you'd say, I need to fund the medicine because that's where we're going to get the solutions to medicine. So solutions come from all over, and so you need cross-pollinating forces while this is going on, but everything has to be funded, but you need the force of attraction. And in space, you walk in front of 8th graders and say, who wants to be an aerospace engineer so that you can design an engine that's 20% more fuel efficient than the one your father flew? Or who wants to be an aerospace engineer because we need a new airfoil that'll navigate the rarefied atmosphere of Mars? I win that one, okay? So you wanna stoke the K through 12 pipeline? You have that writ large and they'll come running to you.
Regina?
So I agree. I have often said that the issue with STEM is one part education, infrastructure, that's important, but it is 9 parts inspiration. And we have got to do a better job of this. I can give you actually a few little examples from recent times of hope. and what this means when you inspire young folks. So in 2009, on the 40th anniversary of the internet, DARPA ran something we called the Red Balloon Challenge, or the Network Challenge. And what we issued was the $40,000 prize to anyone who could correctly locate 10 8-foot red weather balloons in undisclosed locations throughout the United States. We announced it in October. We put the balloons up on December 5th. $40,000 to see just how powerful the internet is 40 years later. What happened was amazing. Those 10 8-foot red weather balloons were found in 8 hours and 52 minutes. The team that did that was a small group of researchers at MIT. They started working on it about 48 hours before we launched the challenge. They built a website. They had a whole incentive structure. They developed all sorts of interesting strategies for sorting out the false reports from the real reports. And by the way, there were about 4 false reports to every 1 real report, so it was a big task. One person who had an extensive Twitter following got up that morning, rolled out of bed, tweeted his following, and 1 hour later had 7 out of 10 balloons. And probably the most remarkable part was that if you watched what happened in the YouTube documentaries, people self-documenting their engagement with this challenge, what you saw was video after video of teenagers getting up early in the morning on a Saturday to search for red balloons. Yeah. And they were participating in a nationwide science experiment. And we have examples of this. We know it works. When they are inspired, they study.
So we have some questions on Twitter, so I'll take it. Mayor Reed may have wanted to say something about this, which is fine, but you also got a question from Zach saying, is there one thing you think other cities can benefit from learning based on what you've had to do in Atlanta?
Sure. I think that other cities can learn that every generation has to make a decision not to kick the can down the road. And my generation needs to stick out its chin and take a hit. Cities across the United States of America have $200 billion pension liability. States have $1 trillion pension liability. So you've got to come to grips with it. And folks, told me that I should wait. I did it in year 1 because I knew that I wouldn't do it in year 3 coming into my reelection with labor unions upset at me. But, I wasn't here for the First World War, the Second World War, the Civil Rights Movement. I wasn't around. But I'm here right now. And I know that the economic prosperity of our country is tied to dealing with hard problems that we happen to have people who are smart enough to solve. So I intend to use my office until the last day of the last hour, the last minute I have it. And I think that to the extent that the city of Atlanta is a model, you can just say, hey, there's this guy in Atlanta, he did this deal. He didn't vilify people. He didn't call people names. He passed it with a 15-0 vote to support of both labor unions. And guess what? He stood up the biggest police force in the city of Atlanta's history, hired 500 police officers, provided the first pay raise in 3 years for folks, and stopped laying people off and build reserves to $100 million so it can be done. Now I just got to get reelected, but that's my deal. Right?
Thank you. I want to ask Mark and Duncan something very specific, because we have had in some of our smaller groups discussions of this. You just made a glancing reference, Mark, to that you had an exciting job and you were doing great things in eco-imagination, but you did have to answer your shareholders. GE is a big company, and everybody knows it's worth taking a few years even to develop some new technology that could have some profound impact in averting the worst consequences of climate change, which is something else we measure from space, Neil. But you made me think of that. Then Duncan talked about crowdfunding as a way to get lots of people involved in imaginative new ideas in the beginning. So my question is, has the very fact that you are working on something that may literally have calamitous consequences if you fail to succeed long term? You can say whatever you want to about this, but if you look at what Swiss Re is, American headquarters is pretty close to my house. All these big reinsurance companies, they're already forcing the people they reinsure to think about how they're going to manage climate change. In Virginia, the politicians may be debating whether global warming or not is real, but mayors are moving whole cities away from the ocean and up higher and dealing with it. And I guess what I want to ask you is, has the fact that GE's been involved in eco-imagination, does that change your relationship with some of your other business partners, number one? And number two, do you think these benefit corporations, this benefit corporation model, and I want to ask you this, which explicitly says to the investors on the front end, we're going to be accountable to you, but we can also take into account the interests of our larger social mission and our customers, our employees, our communities. Do you think that there will be more of these corporations set up and that may get you more partners who don't have the massive wealth and presence GE does? I'd like for both of you to talk about that a little bit.
Sure, I'll start and then I'll let you jump in. I think the fundamental starting point is the problem sets we're trying to attack, hopefully together, are so large that any one organization obviously can't make as significant a dent in those problems. So by definition, even of the magnitude of DARPA or GE, you better exercise your partnership muscle for a couple of reasons. This space is moving so fast. If you think all great ideas sit inside your four walls, that's a real scary thought process. And so, and there's a couple of examples here, crowdsourcing in general, whether it's to find balloons or to finance startups, I think is an incredibly essential sort of community development of networks and ecosystems. The Eco Challenge started 2 years ago, was about that. It was GE putting up $100 million, venture capital firms putting up $100 million, crowdsourcing for, we started with ideas around the smart grid. You know, frankly, even though we have 5 global research centers and 1,500 PhDs all working on these problems, and I would argue they're pretty excited to come to GE and work on these problems. I may need a little different marketing tone here apparently, but I'll work on that. We looked at 5,000 business plans in less than 6 months, funded 24 different partnerships, and I now have the process in place to not just get these partnerships, I'd call it into the funnel, but scaling. What we're most in need of is not ideas that sit around in the germination stage, although we got to continue to work that robustness. I would argue that together we need to scale and commercialize these ideas, because ultimately, frankly, both for economics and to truly impact the global footprint, we got to get these technologies dispersed. And while I'm incredibly proud to be one of the leading providers of wind turbines and solar, still the penetration of these technologies is frankly meager. And so it is through these partnerships that I think are essential. We see that as important. These folks have ideas. I have what they need, and that is great technology evaluation, very deep domain expertise in the business, and a global distribution that can take Oblong, which is a company you'd see in the Minority Report, right? How do I manage that data? Who can dramatically affect the smart grid, because now I have information visible and actionable to truly impact energy distribution throughout the world. So partnerships, absolutely essential. Second question, Mr. President, around new forms of corporations. I think we ought to experiment with them. I'm a little reticent to sort of redo the metrics, if you will. You know, we get that tension all the time. I think we ought to demand greater innovation out of our organizations to say, do both. Give me the economics, give me the environmental performance in our case. On the health imagination side, give me innovation that delivers lower cost, higher quality, and greater access for healthcare through planet Earth. And really put the pressure on innovation to get both of those dynamics going.
Yeah, In the interest of time, I don't want to add too much to that, but it's hard not to agree with almost all that, right? The partnerships are the only way everyone's going to move forward, and you heard examples on this panel that are unbelievable partnerships, and what you also heard was part of the solution to the STEM problem is what you identified with the gamification of the thing, right? Who would have thought that a bunch of gamers would solve that problem? But that's because we're not, our heads aren't screwed on properly, right? They're actually, that's the way they want to learn. They're incredibly bright, and you identified a lot of people where you just uncovered their capability. You found what they were really good at. But the most important thing we need to do when we try to have this take care of your shareholders, take care of your corporate responsibility issues peacefully coexist, all we're really doing as corporate leaders or as civic leaders like the mayor, if we just come in every day and say, pay it forward and leave it better than you found it, all you're doing is you're actually investing entirely in the future, potentially at the expense of your own job. And what I find pretty ironic is the assumption for most politicians who are career politicians is, can't do that because my job is to make sure I stay where I am. What you're seeing here is a mayor who's doing exactly the opposite, and guess what? He's more likely to get reelected than he was otherwise, and we're seeing the same thing in Italy, right? They put a government in place in Italy that is by definition temporary from the outset. They want them to leave, and they had to promise to leave in the spring of 2013 so that the three political parties who typically run the place didn't have to make any tough decisions. Monti goes in there, makes all the tough decisions, changes things that everyone would have said you couldn't possibly change in Italy, and the guy's approval rating is higher than almost any other leader in the world right now. Yep. So sometimes if you actually do the right thing, it works, right? So why don't we all try that for a while?
Neil, it does sometimes. But Tom Foley and a lot of people that did the right thing for me and got this debt under control and were responsible in 1993 for getting rid of over 90% of the deficit that led us to a balanced budget. They gave up their careers to do it under the withering fire of demagoguery. So let's not be too rosy-eyed here. You know, a lot of people who condemn these politicians elected them because they told them what they wanted to hear. And so I can say that because I'm not running for anything anymore. But I think it's important to realize the thing that made Kasim's speech meaningful is that, you know, it could lead to his demise. That's what makes it brave. If it was easy, somebody else could do it. Let me ask you a couple of very practical questions here. We've got three good ones. Neil, you know that I'm with you. I didn't want to see NASA abandon its manned space mission. But do you believe this commercial thing can work? And if you got the whatever money we save from getting rid of it, if I gave it to you tomorrow and let you put it into NASA, what would you do with it? What is the most effective thing to deal with our long-term need for a stronger presence in science and technology we could do in space tomorrow?
I would say it's still not enough money. You need to double NASA's budget. And so you'd have to go higher than that. Well, you were president.
Okay, I'll give you that much, but what would you do with it?
Double. Oh, it's easy. All right, you double the budget, then you no longer have to pick your destination. You say, this is an example. You'd set up a whole suite of launch vehicles. One can take you to the near side of the moon, one to the far side, one to Mars, one to that asteroid that might be headed our way, and so that the solar system becomes your backyard. There could be scientific reasons for going to Mars. There could be geopolitical reasons for going to the moon. There could be touristic reasons for going into orbit. There could be security reasons, like for saving the species to deflect an asteroid that could be headed our way. And so it's all happens. And when you advance that frontier, somebody's got to innovate. That's my point. And there's a lot of misinformation about private sector, private enterprise. SpaceX, for example, docked with the space station, first time ever. That should have been happening decades ago. The private sector will never lead a space frontier because they can't. The space frontier is expensive, it's dangerous, and unknown risks. You combine these three, you cannot establish a capital market valuation of that enterprise. So governments take these first steps. Just as Columbus was the first European to get to the New World, not the Dutch East India Trading Company. They came later, once the trade winds were mapped, and once the coastlines were established, and once the hostiles were, and the friendlies were known. Then the private enterprise comes in, and so Private enterprise surely has a role to turn the routine space activities into efficient operations so that you go from a space program to a space industry. But you still need the vision statement of the nation to take you where you've never been before. And that's where the true innovations come. And let it be known that NASA has been partners with private industry forever. Yep. The LEM, which landed on the moon, was designed and built in Bethpage, New York by Grumman. And so NASA and private enterprise have been together forever. The real issue is, will private enterprise conduct its own business? And they ought to. But when that happens, and all those innovations occur, they then become the headlines of every next day's paper. And that resonates. And I'm a kid, I want to be a part of that enterprise. And in so doing, you would have compelled the nation to long for the immensity of the open cosmos.
The reason I wanted him to answer that question, besides the fact that it's beautiful to listen to and incredibly eloquent, is he made a very important distinction that outer space is no different from on land in America, on Earth. A lot of us who strongly support NASA's mission understand that there's a fundamental R&D purpose for NASA with unpredictable consequences and breaking new barriers that you cannot expect the private sector to undertake. I mean, look how big GE has to be just to have an eco-imagination division, and they still got to come up with some reasonable commercial connection to what they're doing. But it's just not true that people who support the NASA mission are against private space flight. At least a lot of us aren't. We think it's really important, and I'm with you. We should have done it years before. You know, I was letting American commercial satellites go up on other countries' missile systems, and some people treated me like I had, sitting in the White House, that had run away from America. I mean, I think that's silly. What you wanted, you've got to keep breaking down the barriers and developing new commercial patterns at the same time. I want to ask, Regina, I want to ask you something, two things really. One, from Carla Casilli, this is really good, because you mentioned the game contest. How will game design alter both the corporate landscape and learning in the U.S. and beyond? First question. And Laura asked, how can we inspire more girls and women to go into and stay into the STEM areas? She says go into, I'm saying go into and stay into. We have real problems there. There's this huge diversion that began somewhere in the late elementary years. And so tell us what you think about both those things. Game design altering both the corporate landscape and learning in the U.S. and beyond, and how can we get more people like you into the STEM areas?
So on the first question, the implications of gaming for corporations and for learning, I think we're just starting to see the power of that now. So I gave you the example of Fold It, what that implies for the development of cures in the pharmaceutical industry. I think when we apply those same strategies, gaming strategies, to learning, what we observe is that students then have the ability to go with the game along their best learning path, as opposed to a path that was determined by some average strategy for learning. And you can't scale that unless you can get it individualized with a student's interaction with, for example, a game. So we're now, I think, just starting to understand the implications of diversity and scale for innovation in all number of fields, in all number of disciplines. So the second question, which is about girls and women, I think girls and women feel inspired by similar things. The desire to go to the moon, the desire to find a cure for a disease. And at the root of getting all involved in science and engineering is that fundamental sense of wonder. So the quote that I use actually was attributed to E. Merrill Root. And what he said was, we need a renaissance of wonder. We need to believe in our hearts and in our souls, in the deathless dream, the eternal poetry, and the perennial sense that life is miracle and magic. And it is.
Can I say, I promise this will be quick, because that's a hard act to follow, but I did want to drive Regina's point home on give you one anecdote, because I'm convinced that a huge part of the solution is just what she said, and we all know it, and yet we don't see enough evidence of it yet. These kids can be taught, but they have to be engaged with. And when we think about it, we ask ourselves as employers every day, as our workforce gets younger, we better figure out there's a new way they want to come to work, there's a new way they want to engage at work, they have different expectations, and you know what? It's all great, because it's the future, and that's what the panel's been all about. And Michelle Green, who runs our social responsibility programs for us worldwide, and I had a chance to see it firsthand when you can get that engagement to work. Can you think of a more boring topic to study as a high school student than financial literacy? Maybe accounting principles 101, you might have me there. Outside of that, you go and say, hey kids, we're gonna come and give you a lecture on financial literacy. They go, great, I'm sick that day. I don't know what day it is, but I'm gonna be out that day. We went into outside of this very town here in Chicago to a pretty low income high school. We took a couple of folks with us from the United States soccer team, and we co-branded a game with Visa where the kids had to play a soccer game against each other, and they had to answer financial literacy questions to advance the ball down the field. We couldn't get these kids to stop playing and learning in the hour and a half that we were there. They would not stop. And they didn't know it, but they were learning stuff that if you had said, we're gonna give you a lecture on financial literacy, forget it. But we gamified it, and guess what? They were beyond engaged. It was great to see. So it can be done, we just have to scale it. So thank you for your inspiration.
Well, I think our future panel did a pretty good job, don't you? Give them a hand. Thank you very much. I think I'm supposed to stand up there, but I'm not going to do it. We'll be informal. This is the end of our second annual Clinton Global Initiative America. I want to thank again our sponsors, JB and NK Pritzker Family Foundation, the Allstate Insurance Company, Dow Chemical, ExxonMobil, the Joyce Foundation, Peter Peterson's Foundation, and Pete Peterson's here today. Thank you very much, and APCO Worldwide. This year, before we started, the people in the room had made 58 commitments, which when fully funded and implemented will create or fill present vacancies of more than 500,000 jobs and have a positive impact on about 4 million Americans. We did something different this year. We didn't sort of press everybody for an advance commitment. We wanted to see whether or not when you went into those little rooms and you got around the tables and you started talking about things, this is how we started CGI all those years ago. Really new ideas would come up to sort of break the stalemate you feel intuitively it has too much of a sway, both in the American economy and a lot of other places around the world. So while these 58 commitments came in and they're great, we've got investments or loans of $176 million to small and medium entrepreneurs, access to STEM education for 150,000 students, 760 million kilowatt hours of energy saved through energy efficiency. I think it is fascinating that as a result of what happened here, in addition to those 58 commitments, 100 more are now being developed by those of you who came because of your encounters with each other and what you heard here. That's the way this was supposed to work all along. And I'll just give you some ideas of some that have come out of our working groups. Duke Energy is going to work with the EPA and the Department of Commerce to offer energy and waste assessments to small and medium-sized manufacturers in Indiana and Kentucky to reduce their carbon footprint. The city of Philadelphia has committed to recapitalizing their entire commercial energy efficiency program to establish a model for continued lending in this sector. That's something we worked on today in the meeting I had with the mayors. We're trying to figure out how to take this infrastructure bank that Mayor Emanuel developed here in Chicago and find a workable model that can be given to every other city in the country. And Mayor Nutter of Philadelphia, being the head of the Mayor's Conference now, has promised to try to do that. We have participants from the Clean Fuel and Transportation Working Group who are going to develop a pilot for a clean bus program in public school districts, which will include educating students and parents in science-related topics. I know you can do this. I do a lot of work mostly in Latin America, changing public transit systems and using the change to educate the people who ride the buses, or in the case of Bogota, Colombia, both the buses and the cabs, they're going to have 100% all-electric cab fleet, about science and how it works and how the energy works. Generations United is going to mobilize 500,000 older adults to launch a public service announcement on National Grandparents' Day in support of increased investments in direct services, not to seniors, but to children. Vet Transfer is committed to accelerate 50 veteran-owned companies over the next 3 years. The President's Advisory Council on Financial Capability has promised to go into partnership with the largest employers in America to facilitate more liquidity, more savings for their employees through financial education and access to innovative products in a way that directly impacts some of the lowest paid employees in the country. The National Council of ERASA and the Center for New York City Neighborhoods are going to develop a community outreach model in New York to communicate financial options to distressed homeowners and to help them access a range of financial relief programs. ROI Distributed, the Bank of America Charitable Foundation, and their partners are going to reconnect young people between the ages of 16 and 24 by bringing their social media expertise, which is considerable, to small businesses. And in return, the small businesses will provide them training, job shadowing, and mentoring opportunities. Citizen Schools, in partnership with Google, Cisco, Fidelity, Cognizant, and Project Exploration, is going to recruit, train, and support 1,000 STEM professionals to lead hands-on training, learning apprenticeships in Chicago expanded learning time schools and in their after-school programs. Senior Entrepreneurship Works is committed to training and providing direct and online support to more than 300 seniors age 50 and over, that seems young to me, to launch new businesses. The Alliance for a Healthier Generation, my foundation's partnership to fight childhood obesity, is going to work with Governor Kitzhaber of Oregon to triple the number of healthy school programs delivered in Oregon as part of the state's commitment to transform the healthcare system there and reduce costs through prevention and wellness. And finally, PathBright is committed to providing free digital portfolios to 1 million underserved students and veterans to improve their chances of being accepted to college and landing in a family-sustaining career. These are just a few of the examples of the things that have been developed here over the last 2 days, in addition to the commitments that were brought here. So I want to thank you for making our little model work, by using your working groups, by talking to each other, by forming these new partnerships. And I want to say again, you know, when this financial crisis hit America in September of 2008, the economy was already weak and had been for years, and I was very worried because for the last 500 years, it normally takes 5 to 10 years to get back to full employment if your financial system collapses. And if there's a mortgage collapse on top of it, it almost always takes a decade. Our friends in Japan had to struggle that long. We're all trying to beat the odds here. And I think we can do it if we can combine smart government, not just nationally, but state and local government, with creative finance, now that the banks have been recapitalized, and the private sector leaders that are out there creating the future and all these young internet whizzes and other social entrepreneurs. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to beat the clock. We're trying to stop wasting human potential. We're trying to remove constraints on growth, and we're trying to do it with less argument and more action. And I'll just leave you with this thought. I love listening to my friend here talk about solving his problems in Atlanta and how he got the support of the Public Employees Union by pointing out that arithmetic had no partisan balance. I just hear the numbers, here's where we are. Atlanta's a great city. We got kids to educate, businesses to grow, streets to maintain and keep safe. We have to do this together. All over the world, including in America, the places that are getting back the quickest have creative networks of cooperation, what you have formed here. All over the world, including in America, the places that are stuck in idle or going in reverse are the places that practice constant conflict. All of you have decided you'd rather be in the former group than the latter. And I hope as you leave here, you will leave with a commitment to get more people in that. I also hope you'll remember how I thought in the previous session like this that Chelsea moderated, how incredibly persuasive John Hope Bryant was, talking about how smart kids are that are treated as if they're not, if you get their engagement going in the right way. You remember why you clapped for Neil when he kept talking about firing the imagination of young Americans. And remember all these people, this is basically, we are engaged in a big, complicated society and trying to figure out not only how to handle the leaky boat problems of today, but how to get our whole nation back into the future business. And we don't have to solve all the problems in the world to have a profound impact on the thinking and acting of millions of other people. So when you leave here today, if you liked it, come back next year and spend the next year trying to get more people into the future business. Thank you very much, and God bless you.